So it's kind of tough sometimes to pick a reading, especially when you get some good ones. I love the story of Samuel, right? I think probably Paul's message in 2 Corinthians could be mined very deeply. That is a very spiritual, attentive spiritual reading there. But I decided to go with the gospel again today. It's good, right? You know, where it's the first Sunday after Trinity, and we find ourselves in that long green season now, and the first Sunday up, we get a miracle. And it seems to be a pretty straightforward miracle, right? Nobody's nodding their head today. Okay. So just maybe give me a little bit of leeway. Let's revisit the story. Jesus enters the synagogue, right? And there among those who are gathered is a man with a withered hand. He is probably back, sort of in the shadows. But Jesus knows he's there. And the Pharisees, ever watchful and ready to accuse Jesus, are observing him closely as he enters the synagogue, because they just had this intense back and forth about grain, of all things, right? But Jesus, though tested in that moment, remains compassionate and is ever ready to teach, or so it seems. And thus he calls the man with the withered hand forth, places him in front of the Pharisees, and asks a poignant question. Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill? We should know that in their minds, healing on the Sabbath and killing on the Sabbath would be against the law. It violates the letter of the law, so to speak. But that's not the full import of the message. I think what the full import of the message is in the small sentence that comes right after that. 4 words. And they were silent. Their silence was their answer. And the story tells that Jesus, he was angered at first, grieved. And so he tells the man to stretch out his hand, restores it in front of them. And in an action that should have sort of inspired awe, right? Like, this man is now whole in front of us. They were incensed. The story, I'm sorry to say, is one of those stories that I think has been tempered by time. It's also one of those miracles that kind of like fall in that category of like other miracles. Like, I really like when Jesus turned water into wine, because I can get behind that, right? I like that. Party. And then there's these healings that we kind of don't know what to do with over here. However, I would say to you, my friends, that our ability to pause here and work with this parable, this healing, is as urgent and necessary for us to do as participating in our own repentance and the need for God's forgiveness and healing grace, to be able to understand that. And that's because we are in a world that is filled with suffering. One just has to watch the news, right? We're in a world where there is pain, injustice, and oppression. And I will tell you that silence speaks. Whatever way you come at this story, this healing, I think probably what is on display is God's compassion. And I hope you notice that that compassion is action-oriented, right? Jesus does something about it, right? He heals the man. Thus, I think our compassion is to be action-oriented. And sometimes I think we look at the law through what Paul says about it, like that it's impossible to be fulfilled, and therefore we can just chuck it. But I think we should remember that the law as a whole was a good. And I think you can see in this healing I think you can see God's heart at work, because his desire is for wholeness, not just for the man, but for those around him. Despite those points of orientation, the story can be challenging for some, because there are some who believes that the law is the law, right? The thing is black and it is white. You do or you don't, right? The law is the law. And though that may be the case in some instances, the story should, I think, cause us to examine our own hearts, our own intention, because Jesus consistently shows us in the Gospels that true discipleship involves seeing and responding to the pain and the suffering that is around us, even and especially when it's hard. And the scriptures, are replete with stories about God hearing and seeing and then doing something about the people's suffering, right? You can go all the way back. You can go all the way back to Exodus, right? Moses was out there chilling with the goats, right? But God had heard the cry of the Israelites, right? Who were being oppressed, called Moses, right? Moses came and had that back and forth with old Pharaoh, right? The Israelites were set free. Prophets like Isaiah and Amos, they spoke up against the injustice and the oppression of their times, right? Israel was conquered in some of those instances, but a remnant was there that rebuilt the city. And Jesus himself, throughout his ministry, consistently reaches out to the marginalized. He heals the sick, and in doing so, he confronts the powers that perpetuate those conditions. And here's the thing, I guess. Here is where this doesn't just sit as a moral exercise for us, right? I'm not up here trying to give you a moral lesson about this, right? But in the sense when we encounter these stories and we see what Jesus does, it's not just to be heard and experienced and we go home and we're like, that was a nice story today. But I think those stories are not just for Jesus to perform, but for us to emulate in our own lives. We are to be action-oriented Christians, in a sense. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is pretty clear about this. The deacon's gospel, Matthew 25, right? What does he say there? Even poses it as not just the least of these, right? But members of my own family. He says, truly I tell you, just as you did it for one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. When someone is in pain, when someone is in need or in despair, we are to see Christ in them. And our compassion in that moment, or lack thereof, speaks volumes. And this can be a hard lesson. We can just leave this at the surface level because it can be a hard lesson because, especially if we've been taken advantage of ourselves. We don't necessarily want to reach back out again if we've been taken advantage of, right? It can be hard and be tempting to remain silent in the face of suffering because we might feel powerless or unsure of the ways that we can sort of insert ourselves. Or we might be fearful of some of the repercussions that might happen if we choose to speak out, especially when something, the cause of some suffering, may be unpopular. But whether that's the case or not, we're all at a threshold, and it's our choice. It's our choice to see and to respond or not to. And so the question might be at that moment, do we take up our cross, which may mean that we may have to enter into that suffering, that we may have to enter into a space where there is suffering and work with the suffering person, right? Work with or against the powers that are creating that suffering towards liberation. That is a lofty calling. But there is a choice in that. And if it comes to a choice, I just want us to remember, right, that those arguing with Jesus that day, they had turned the Sabbath into a burden with rigid rules and restrictions all over the place, losing sight of its true purpose. When Jesus and his disciples plucked those heads of grain on the Sabbath, the Pharisees criticized that act, but Jesus responded with a profound truth that still rings true today, and that the Sabbath was made to serve humanity, not the other way around. And as servants, we should definitely hear that message, so that the Sabbath doesn't become for us some observance of an uninformed, rigid experience, but one that is ultimately about not just other people's liberation, but ours. And that liberation should be joy-filled. Today is a day to experience God's grace in and through each other, in and through the gifts that God gives us in the Eucharist. It's a day that we, I think, are encouraged to seek freedom from the incessant demands that life places upon us sometimes. And it's a day, I think, that we are encouraged to remember that we are loved deeply, that you are loved deeply by God. Not just for what you do, but for who you are. This miracle challenges us to prioritize love over legalism. And our faith calls us to prioritize empathy and compassion over apathy and self-interest whenever we can. Your witness, my friends, is a powerful one, especially when you stand against the forces that create suffering in this world, in all the ways that manifests before you, whether you live in Bartlesville or you're from someplace else. And it should be especially true when someone looks at you and says, let's handle it tomorrow. The virtues of compassion and justice should shape the way we respond to need with a sense of urgency And by refusing to remain silent, we embody the teachings of Jesus, and I think we bear his witness, his witness in the world. And we have an invitation to be part of his transformative power, not just in this life, but in the legacy that we leave behind.